was. But what would have happened had Stalin died, or had there been no Stalin? So the regime, as it was in the 1920s, was a single-party dictatorship. Industry was owned by the state, and in the countryside, where the vast majority of people lived, and where the wealth was, the size of the harvest was the main factor in GDP, was a private capitalist system, more or less.
At least after NEP, no? After
Quasi-market, so-called new economic policy from the early 1920s through the late 1920s. There was no new economic policy in industry. It was state-owned, so-called commanding heights. Only about 10% of GDP that was manufacturing was artisanal production. And there was no political new economic policy because there was a single-party dictatorship and censorship. But there was a quasi-market in the countryside where, as I said, more than 80% of the people lived and where the wealth was produced. And so there were actually two revolutions: the urban, Bolshevik, communist, single-party dictatorship with censorship based upon a vision of an industrial future, and the peasant revolution, which was separate, independent, and too strong for the Bolsheviks, too strong for the communists. That's why they conceded the new economic policy. And all throughout the 20s, they were wringing their hands, right, banging their heads against the wall. What are we going to do about this capitalist-like peasant revolution in the countryside? Are we going to confront it or not? And if we're going to confront it, how is that even possible? Because we have almost no communists in the countryside. The countryside was out of their control. The red flags, the red banners, the slogans, they disappeared right after you left the big cities. They vanished. And so this problem of the regime's fate, the revolution's fate in the 1920s was clear to them all. Now, Stalin built a personal dictatorship within the dictatorship. This was an act of unbelievable skill that the book devotes a great deal of attention to. Now, Stalin was no genius. He made many mistakes. He had no understanding of fascism, for example, which was a big thing to get wrong. So we don't want to make him out to be better than he was. He was very blinkered. But when it came to building a personal dictatorship inside the communist dictatorship, he was very good at that. And that's what he did. So he had the authority to make decisions that others couldn't participate in even, let alone make. And so he was controlling the situation with his personal dictatorship, but he didn't have control over the country. That's very important.
Throughout the 20s.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so you can imagine without him, who's talented enough to keep the dictatorship together? And you look
Do you see any potential
you look at the
candidates
inside of the Bolshevik regime, and you don't see such talented
yeah.
people at the top. Now, of course, some people come out of nowhere, right? All of a sudden, they are, I don't know, in the Senate for a day or two, and then they're president, right? That happens. So it could be that somebody else could have come up from somewhere in the regime that we underestimate now because they didn't have that opportunity. But if you look at the actual goings-on in the regime at the time, you'd be pessimistic about a figure with that skill level on the inside of the regime. Moreover, the regime couldn't manage the quasi-market. It kept ruining its own new economic policy, such that the peasants didn't deliver the grain anymore. And
that
so
was the crisis of when? 28?
Already 26, 27, 28, it wasn't working anymore.
And they lost nerves. They tried violent
The communist regime in a capitalist world, a capitalist-dominated world, and with a capitalist-like countryside, was a minoritarian regime, and it was in trouble. And it looks to me like, of course, we'll never know, but it looks to me like the regime would have collapsed. It looks to me like they would have softened the one-party dictatorship.
They would have to. They would be forced.
They would not have been able to hold it together. And we would have ended up with either a new crisis that spawned violence and another kind, maybe a military dictatorship, a right-wing dictatorship, or a different version of the left, or we would have had themselves conceding and evolving towards a recognition that the capitalist-like countryside was here to stay, and we would have a mixed economy, and therefore we would have a mixed polity also. Now, the interesting comparison here is contemporary China.
That's what I
Deng
wanted to
Xiaoping.
say. Could Bukharin have been Russian Deng Xiaoping?
Deng Xiaoping conceded the market in the economy, but of course held the communist monopoly, which is retained to this day. And so this lesson of retaining central control somehow, but giving up the ideology in the economy, is an example that the Chinese have now taught us. Whether this was possible in the 1920s conditions is unclear. The international situation is a factor here. The ability to get loans and international banks or other forms of financing to participate in the world economy was under threat because they had repudiated the Tsarist loans. The infrastructure was quite poor. There are many factors here, including that there was no Deng Xiaoping in the 1920s regime, which is no minor factor.
So you think Bukharin was not strong enough
So
to...
Nikolai Bukharin, unfortunately, was not a significant politician and didn't have the skill set necessary to be a leader. Alexei Rykov, who was the number two person in the regime, he had Lenin's position. Remember, Lenin was the head of the government, effectively the prime minister, and Rykov inherited that position after Lenin died in January 1924. He was a very powerful, effective manager and a smart politician, and Stalin relied on him to run the economy all throughout the 20s, and Rykov was not removed, even though Bukharin was removed. Stalin still had to rely on Rykov. Rykov chaired the Politburo meetings because the head of the government, by tradition from Lenin, chaired the Politburo meetings. Stalin was the head of the party, but not the head of the government, like Rykov was. So Rykov was the number two person in the regime, and he's the most significant person after Stalin. And so I looked very closely at Rykov and his re-examining the original materials on Rykov, and he's an impressive figure, but he's also a communist. We have the impression, because Rykov opposed Stalin's forced collectivization, that maybe he was a little bit, pro-market or pro-quasi-market. It turns out that Rykov had no special love for the peasants and no special love for capitalism, private property, and the markets. His argument was that it would be catastrophic if we tried to overturn it, and so we can't do that at this time. But at some point, we will have to go after the markets, go after private property, and get to socialism. Socialism being a stage to communism, right? Feudalism, capitalism, socialism, communism. Socialism is not the end point, it's the intermediate stage. And so unfortunately, Rykov was not a person like Deng Xiaoping who accepted the permanent existence of markets and private property. The guy who came closest, and he's a semi-hero in the book, was named Gersh Brilliant, Diamond, Gersh Brilliant, and his name is Sokolnikov. Remember, nobody has their real names. This is the Russian Revolution, right? Stalin's name was Djugashvili. And Sokolnikov, who was the finance minister, came the closest to accepting the market as a permanent institution, almost on the edge of social democracy. And in fact, Sokolnikov came at a party congress and asked Stalin to resign his post as general secretary.
When?
In 1925, December 1925. It was a bold, very courageous speech. It was a speech on principle that no person should have this much power and that there should be democracy inside the party. Not democracy for multi-parties, but democracy inside the party. That was a step, at least.
So when did that Sokolnikov disappear?
And
in
Sokolnikov
Gulag?
was removed.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Stalin removed him reluctantly
Immediately,
in January 1926 from finance commissar, but he kept him in the Central Committee. That's how important Sokolnikov invented the currency. He's the one that made the new economic policy function, relying on bankers and economists left over from the Tsarist regime, but smart enough to take their advice. Anyway, so there were some figures. Bukharin wouldn't be one of them, but Rykov and Sokolnikov were the ones that I singled out towards the end through the book and then especially towards the
Yeah, I
end
know
if
that.
Stalin had died. So one could imagine people like that avoiding collapse by reluctantly, grudgingly coming around to accepting the market the way Deng Xiaoping reluctantly, grudgingly came around to accepting the market in the late 70s and early 80s. But there's little evidence that they were prepared to do that in the 20s.
And even did they have a strong enough base? By base, I mean not in people, who cares about that, but within nomenclatura, bureaucracy.
If Stalin had died, Rykov would have been strong enough to take power. Yes, there's no question. But unfortunately, Stalin didn't die.